Hi, welcome. I'm Sarah Mirk. I'm moderating this panel. And I'm just going to start out with a land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on the traditional villages of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Indigenous people have created communities in this area for the last 11,000 years. We want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of Indigenous leaders and families and pledge to make ongoing efforts and to recognize their knowledge, creativity, and resilience. So thanks for being here. Like I said, I'm Sarah Mirk, and this panel is called Gender, Sexuality, and Abundant Housing. Cities have historically always been sanctuary for the queer community. Yet as American sexuality and gender roles have expanded and evolved, our housing paradigms have not, and the LGBT population suffers from higher rates of housing precarity at every metric. So how this panel is going to work is each of our panelists will talk for about 10 minutes about a topic they're interested in. And after each presentation, we'll ask them questions and talk about their work and offer thoughts. And you're also welcome to offer questions then. And at the end of all these 3 mini talks, we'll take even more questions and talk about them all together. And does that sound good? Any questions? Any questions? Okay. So today with us on the panel, we have Esme D. Miller, the Assistant Director of Research and Assessment at the Graduate School of Education and Counseling, Lewis and Clark College, and a doctoral candidate at Rutgers University. She has been involved in housing advocacy in NYC and Portland since the early 2000s. She lives in Northeast Portland and takes life one day at a time, buoyed by a deep gratitude for the queer, mixed, and blended family of her later life, utterly unimaginable in her youth. Esme will talk first about her doctoral research, which explores body, gender, and sexuality in the logging camps and mill towns of the early 20th century Pacific Northwest, a place and time where the heterosexual household was largely a class privilege. Hi, Esme. And then next up, we have Dan Reed, who is a writer, urban planner, and community advocate. Dan works with communities all over the United States to make their streets safer, enjoyable, and equitable. Their writing has appeared in publications including the Washingtonian Magazine, the New York Times, City Lab, Architect Magazine, and Shelter Force. A resident of Silver Spring, Dan has written neighborhood blog Just Up the Pike since 2006. And Dan will be talking today about the evolution of gayborhoods, specifically how gayborhoods in Washington, D.C. have changed as the city gentrifies. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
And finally, we'll hear from the great Nancy Haque, who is the Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon. Under her leadership, Basic Rights Oregon has expanded its racial justice work as a founding member of the executive team of One Oregon, an immigrant, refugee, and Muslim justice coalition. Basic Rights Oregon also deepened its commitment to transgender justice by launching Catalyst, a leadership development cohort for transgender and gender nonconforming Oregonians. Prior to joining the staff of Basic Rights, Nancy spent 7 years as the Building Political Power Director at the Western States Center, where she led a voter organizing, training, and empowerment project. The daughter of immigrant parents from Bangladesh, Nancy is the first member of her family in the United States, born in the United States. She grew up in the DC area, where she was inspired to become politically engaged, joining her first protest as a 4th grader. And she studied political economy and social change at Evergreen State College and has a master's degree from the Center for Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Today, she lives in Southeast Portland with her young son and is an aspirational baker and crafter. And Nancy will be talking about the root causes of why the queer community is overrepresented in houseless communities and why we need community-specific housing. So thanks so much for being here, everybody. Yay! Okay, so Esme's up first, and you're going to talk for about 15 minutes about your research into mill towns, and then think of questions as we're going along, okay?
Well, hello, you all. Good morning. So I assume that everyone who's here is here because you're interested in housing for queer survival, right? And when we talk about that narrative, we often start with the ascendancy of the single-family home in the context of post-World War II homophobia and white flight and suburbanization. But there was a time before that. And so what I want you all to know as housing advocates is that we have ancestors in this work. Imperfect ancestors, yes, but this is not new, okay? So there was a form of housing advocacy rooted in the labor movement in the early 20th century that I think we need to tune into and be aware of, because these labor-based organizers and activists were dealing with the kind of oppression that we see coming down on us today, okay? So I'm gonna start here with a newspaper article from the Oregonian from 1919. This is the first draft zoning legislation proposed in the city of Portland. It wasn't passed till 1924. And in some ways, this is a familiar story. In 1917, oh, hey, we got feedback on the audio. Okay, you got it. Great. In 1917, the Supreme Court outlawed the most explicit forms of racial segregation, right? And so in response, cities around the country rushed to institute economic forms of exclusion that would skirt the Supreme Court ruling. So this was the Buchanan v. Worley ruling. I'm going to turn a little bit so I can see the screen here. So in some ways, this is a really familiar story that happened across the country at this time. But there's more to it here in the Northwest. So I'm going to zoom in here on some of the text of this Oregonian editorial voice, which is exactly like the Oregonian editorial voice today. Thus, home ownership, the backbone of the city, whom from all points of view, economic, social, or moral, it is the city's most imperative duty to foster and protect from the invasion of flats and apartments with their floater population. Well, who is this floater population? That's what we're going to be looking at today. Flats and apartments are needed in the city, but not scattered through every block to discourage and make less desirable the home of the most important social unit, which is the single family living and developing by itself. Well, it sounds like our author here is worried about the status of the single family. Why is this author worried? Okay, so who is this floater population? Does anybody want to volunteer? What was the primary industry of the Northwest in the teens and 20s? Yes, absolutely, lumber industry, okay? So in 1919, the city of Portland had just been through, during World War I, the great 1917 Pacific Northwest lumber strike, when the industrial workers of the world shut down the entire industry in the middle of World War I. And then a wave of federal repression of the Wobblies, which included prosecutions under the Mann Act and anti-prostitution statute. And so we'll get to why the Wobblies were seen as being sexually deviant by the federal government. This was a society more focused on extractive plunder than the usual settler colonial project of producing white babies on the land. Portland had a 60-40 sex ratio in 1920. In the rural logging districts, that could reach 75% male, 25% female. So here we have all these guys before the employment agency boards. We're going to zoom in on some of the jobs you could hire out to the woods for. So men would hire out to the woods when there wasn't work in town. Working class men and women often lived separately. So there were marriages, there were babies, but often the men and women lived separately. What does this mean? Your intimate emotional relationships are same-sex relationships, okay? So men stood before these job boards and gave up their bodies unto the desire of capital, hoping to return to town imbued with the stature of cash. So if you read through this job board, you'll notice the fifth item is Japanese boy for kitchen work. So one of the ways that white supremacy manifested in this era is that Native and Asian men were relegated to the feminized professions, whereas European immigrant men had direct access to the primary form of employment. which was work in the lumber industry. But that too came with a price, because the industry addressed their bodies as a commodified product that was produced for and consumed by the work of the woods, right? So here we see this landscape of colonial extractive plunder. Capital beheld these men's bodies with a wanton eye. Come on, clicker, you can do it. There we go. So what you're seeing here is a form of a view of industrial desire. This is from a investor's pamphlet featuring a strapping young logger who will go out to the woods and secure a return on your investment for a price. Yeah, I love this image. It's really something. Okay, so in spite of the companies that beheld men's bodies in this lecherous way, men turned away from the abusive gaze of the company, renouncing the claim of mastery that was the first requirement of the masculinity of their day. So here we have male labor radicals speaking in a language of suffering and survivorhood. And if I can, my clicker's going to work, I'm going to bring up a quote here. So everybody read through this and raise your hand when you've read it.
Is that lousy, like with lice?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. That's the origin of the word lousy. Okay, so I will tell you this passage. This is an elder, former Wobbly elder interviewed in his 70s in 1977, helped me come out because I began this project while closeted. The way in which he is able to step away from the requiring to claim that he had it all figured out, as most of the men of his era did, just beautiful to behold. So the men turned away from the abusive gaze of the company and turned towards each other. This is my greatest research finding. This is from a log of pay stubs held in Oregon Historical Society. And in the notes on the pay stubs are the details of a gay romance. So Rives finished his partnership with me in this camp, went to his home in Jonestown, Mississippi the following December 4th. He was a splendid boy, honest, faithful, and a good worker, and I shall miss him a whole lot. Right? And there are lots of these stories of the men who worked out in the woods. So they found refuge in each other. But the daughters of the mill towns, too, grew wary of the heterosexual household. So next we're going to read something from Julia Rudula, who is the great mid-20th century labor gadfly of Portland, who was the daughter of a Wobbly organizer but also had an unhappy marriage to a mill hand at the age of 17. And she wrote a work of autobiographical fiction that was never published, but that kind of tells this story. So in her heroine is, this is in the voice of her heroine. Bud Peterson, who took the slab wood out of the conveyor, had even asked her to marry him. But although she longed to escape from her family, some trait of caution in her Scotch inheritance kept her from taking the fatal step. Marriage in Milltown meant babies, debts, and bickering. So, okay, why are working class women wary of marriage? Because it was fundamentally unwise to cast one's lot upon any particular man. So the shadow of death, because the shadow of death hung over the men crashing flophouse rooms in 3s and 5s, grasping at the life that might not be theirs in a week or a month. The boys who have been in the brush a long time relished the feel of the pavement and the brightly lighted shop windows. And yet, like returning veterans, they felt out of place and disconnected from those who slept soundly and invested themselves in the future in the confidence they'd see it. So we're going to do a quick walking tour of Old Town in 1908, which is when the fire insurance maps were drawn. In the Northwest, zoning was not only about racial segregation, but also an attempt to confine working class gender and sexuality to the social landscape of the Skid Row district. So here we are at the foot of the Burnside Bridge between 2nd and 3rd. Portlanders, you can probably envision this block. Notice we have a saloon and theater going on here. The S just means store. We don't have a lot of detail on the Portland fire insurance maps as to what these businesses were. But one of the ways we can think of the landscape of saloons and SROs that hosted the, we can think of it as infrastructure that hosted the loggers in town after they returned from the woods. It's what was needed to sustain a large population of itinerant men. Here we have another concert hall and saloon. Here we have an SRO-style hotel and bar. Okay, now we're gonna go one block west. So we're between 3rd and 4th here. So the Skid Row district was also the industrial district. You'll see the Southern Pacific Railroad running right down the middle of 4th in this era. And it was also the red light district. So all of these businesses with FB, that's short for female boarding. Anybody want to guess what that was? Okay. So, and notice here's the Salvation Army right next to all the brothels, trying to save the sex workers and their clients. Okay, we're gonna go across the railroad tracks. So we're still, now we're between 4th and 5th. We have more female boarding as well as some industrial businesses. And then we're gonna go one block north. My directions of my scrolling are off, but that's okay. So, and here we have Chinese stores and tenements. In 1908 was the beginning of the expulsion of Chinese businesses and residences from the original Chinatown on the site of what is now the Pioneer Place Mall. So this is the beginning of Chinatown being forced north of Burnside. So the Skid Row district was also the same few blocks into which Asian immigrants were compressed under de facto segregation. So this was the urban environment that the daughters of the Milltowns encountered when they left an abusive father or an early marriage. It was also the environment that the loggers encountered when they returned from camp, as camp closed for the winter. And this urban environment looked upon the loggers impersonally. I have a quote here. Loggers with money were looked upon with as much favor as a fine stand of timber at the water's edge. So if you found yourself on these streets unhoused in the early 20th century, if you turned up in the Skid Row district in the need of refuge, charities offered lodging in exchange for adherence to middle-class mores. So here, this is the YMCA, the YWCA building in downtown Seattle. Some of you may have even stayed here. In order to stay here, you had to enroll in domestic science classes. They would not train young women to be clerks or entrepreneurs because the primary business of this was providing servants to their wealthy funders. So we can look at the title of their publication, Young Women, as an advertisement of wares. But the labor men and women of this era often harbored subversive domestic aspirations. Feminists and radicals within the labor movement did not seek to ascend into the private heterosexual household. And you can find these kinds of records in the Seattle Women's Card and Label League, which was an amazing group of early 20th century labor feminists, as well as in IWW-affiliated activists and organizers. And throughout the early 20th century, these people were organizing cooperative boarding houses and even agitating for municipal boarding houses as a public utility. Like, think about that, what that means if you are a displaced person without family, okay? So this is a vision of public provision of care, sustenance, and recuperation outside of any private household. So, and this is not just a vision, this is a vision that was often enough realized and even came into being. So the Seattle Waitresses Union, led by the inimitable Alice Lord, actually founded their own cooperative boarding house that they sustained for about 25 years. And so here is the Seattle Waitresses Union Recreation Home, right? So these are domestic spaces that I think have precedence in what we are looking to advocate or organize, or what I think we all in this room might be looking to advocate and organize for, right? And this is not new. And this kind of housing advocacy comes from this era, and I want it to be connected to this era. So to do the transition to today, like the boys who have been in the brush a long time, our queer youth seeking refuge in the city often find precious little of it. We have entered a new gilded age, increasingly focused on driving the poor from sight as scarcity enriches the owners of property. So remember, we're not alone in this. We've been in this fight a long time, and we walk in the company of ancestors who survived times like these before. Thank you.
Thanks, Esme. I can't believe you haven't taught this before, because that was so interesting. Yeah, that's super interesting. I would read whatever book you write about this. Does anybody in the audience have any questions so far? Nancy and Dan, you have any thoughts or questions for Esme?
I think what strikes me is that you see this pattern in so many cities where, like, the place that was where non-cis, non-het people had to live was also the place where people of color lived, was also the place where everything that you didn't want was all in the same place, sort of one-stop shopping. And it's just interesting, you see this in every city. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to my presentation in DC, like all the sort of layering of all of those things. So, yeah.
One thought I had was looking at all those maps of Old Town in 1909 or whatever, and we're thinking about moving offices to Old Town, and one of the big questions is safety, right? And just about place and why some places seem unsafe and have for over 100 years, right? And that's always been its designation. And I don't know, I think a lot about why, I lived in Richmond, Virginia for 2 years, right? And they had tried to build a mall on top of what had been a slave marketplace. It was called the 6th Street Marketplace, and it always failed. Whatever business went there always failed. And you just think about
Yes.
what stories are buried here? What happened here that makes it so broken?
Yes, right. There are ghosts on those streets.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's funny you mentioned 6th Street Marketplace because in Richmond, which is 2 hours from my house, I've gone there a bunch of times, there's a big thrift store called Diversity Thrift, which is, you can see it from the highway, it's got a big flag on the side of it. And I remember searching through it one day with my friends when I went down to visit, and there was this painting of this thing that it was like a shopping mall. It was this beautiful watercolor painting from the 80s, and it was an old ratty frame. And I didn't know what it was called. It was called 6th Street Marketplace. I was like, this is really cool. This was probably hanging on the wall of some architect's or developer's office, and I took it home. I bought it for 25 cents. Didn't know what it was. I took it home, and it hangs over my bed now. And I read that story of this is this place where they have these grand ideals of we're going to bring black and white Richmond together in a city that has, to this day, still a lot of the scars, social and physical, of the Confederacy. And it failed because I think the idea was we are going to try and address this hurt in a way that does not acknowledge any of the history whatsoever, and why the hurt is there. What's the name? Isn't it like the Philip Morris has offices there or something? It's not something very, very weird. But it's a beautiful photograph, beautiful painting. I need to get a new frame for it because it's falling apart.
And Esme, I was curious, you mentioned that the Wobblies, the organizers, were seen as sexually deviant.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Was it the police just sort of projecting onto them, or was there actually documented queer life within the
Right.
Wobblies?
So this is, if any of you want to read more on this, this is Heather Mayer's work, who wrote about sexual
radicalism amongst the Portland IWW in particular. First of all, the general ambiance of working class life was queer. Like, if we think about why does post-World War II homophobia happen, it's a class-based reaction to their parents' generation living in these kind of labor camp environments, okay? So there's that general thing going on, but for the Wobblies in particular, for the Wobbly men in particular, because they are out, they have been alienated from what is required to be a man in their society. And so you see them taking quasi-feminist positions, which is just fascinating to see happening amongst early 20th century labor men. Many of the Wobblies, men and women, were free love advocates, right? Which was a scary topic. Like, we talk about today's trans panic, right? That was the panic of that era. And, you know, I can't remember the exact year the Mann Act was passed, but there was, in the teens, there was also what is, like, I'm reluctant to even say the name of this moral panic but it was the white slave moral panic, which was about fear of the sex trade. And, you know, so like anti-sex work campaigns also go back to this era. And so there was federal anti-sex work legislation passed in the teens. And because many of the Wobblies renounced the institution of marriage, the Mann Act was used to prosecute them.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Got a question in the audience?
Yeah, you actually just alluded to this, but I was wondering about like sex worker organizing as well. Like, we talked about the Wobblies and their
Sure.
labor organizing, and then we saw the brothels and cooperatives.
Yes, yes. There's very fleeting records on this, but I do know that in all of the wild labor ferment on Grays Harbor in Aberdeen, Washington, in the aughts and teens, there was a Wobbly-inspired prostitutes union. There's not anymore. There's just like a mention of it, right? This is like what's left in the historical record. But I guess what I might speak a little more to is sex work was criminalized in Portland and Seattle in like I'm trying to remember the timing here, around 1912. And a large part of my dissertation is what is the environment of sex work pre-criminalization? And because these are overwhelmingly male societies, sex work is actually pretty freaking lucrative, and certainly compared to domestic service or laundry work, right? And so in these pre-criminalization societies that are in a chaotic early colonial environment, sex workers, male and female, move back and forth between different roles. So it's not a stigmatized social identity. And the process of criminalization is about making it a stigmatized social identity. So yes, criminalization of sex work is something that was done, that happened. It hasn't always been thus.
Anyone else have a question? I just have one more, which I wanted to clarify, which was, it sounded like that Oregonian editorial was setting up like the single family household, like versus these floater populations, like renter populations, which would be single men or single women. Mm-hmm. Was the single family household like seen as what I would think of as a single family household today, which is like a man and woman who are cis and married and having kids and own their home? And like, is that what they were thinking of as a single family household, or was it something that was multi-generational or something different than what I'm perceiving?
It would have been more multi-generational, and it would, of course, because they are advocating for the bulk of the city to be reserved for people of a certain class. There would also be servants, because this is pre-domestic technology, right? There are not washing machines, right? Running a household of any size middle and upper class households always had servants, and middle and upper class women were always complaining about their difficulty obtaining servants. So,
And I was just hoping you could speak a little bit more to like how that idea of a single family household being better than renter or single populations played into racial segregation.
oh, okay. Let me just back up a little bit. I guess what I will say is that that concept is a settler colonial concept, because it's about what is the intended purpose of the bodies of the single family household. It is to produce white babies who will secure the white claim to the land. Okay? And that is the usual pattern of colonization in the English colonies. But it is not exactly what happened in the Northwest, because the lumber industry was so profoundly focused on quick, short-term profit, right? And so in a way, what you see, the dispute you're seeing showing up here is a dispute between elites who want to focus on production of white babies to secure the white claim to the land, and other elites who are interested in making a quick buck real quick, extracting the natural resources. I don't know if that helps.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I was just thinking about who was allowed to buy homes at that time.
Oh,
and who
right.
was-
And the other thing is that Asian immigrants were ineligible for citizenship in that era, and then all of the West Coast states had laws preventing anyone who is ineligible from citizenship from owning property. So, like, why could the original Chinatown be forced out of its location downtown? Because all of those homes and businesses were leased. Because no one in the late 19th, early 20th century Chinese community here could own property.
Well, thank you for spelling that out. And if anyone has any questions for Esme, we can take them at the end, so just keep thinking on that. And now we'll hear from Dan. Hi, Dan.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Dan Reed. I don't have any slides because I had a fun time with slides yesterday. So I'm just gonna speak at length, and you can stop me if you have any questions. So I grew up in outside of Washington D.C. in a place called Montgomery County, Maryland. It is known as one of the most progressive communities in the country. But before Florida had its Don't Say Gay bill, for much of my childhood growing up there, you were not allowed to discuss any kind of LGBTQ life in public school because of pushback from very conservative parents. So when I was trying to come out in 2003 at the age of 15, I remember my health teacher saying, you can ask me questions about it, but I cannot initiate any conversations about it. And so you can imagine I said nothing. What I did know is that there was a neighborhood about 10 miles away called DuPont Circle, which is where they were gay people. And when I finally came out when I was 17, the first thing I said is I'm going to go there. This was, part of the lore of DC, right? DuPont Circle is where there were gay people. When I was in graduate school and I had an internship downtown, this girl who'd come in from Indianapolis on her first weekend in town said, "Where should I go?" And I said, "Well, you should probably go to DuPont Circle. It used to be the gayborhood, but," and she stopped me and she said, "Well, you would want me to go there? No, you can go there, but I don't want to go there." The irony is that, at the peak of the gay rights movement in the city, which was, the later 20th century, that was the gayborhood, but has since dramatically expanded beyond those boundaries in a couple of different ways. One is that, as DC has had a dramatic transformation in the past 20 years or so, and significant investment has come into the city from a variety of different ways, and significant gentrification, what you want to call it, the neighborhood has expanded past its original boundaries. I don't have a map behind me, but if you can imagine DC is shaped like a diamond. Rock Creek Park runs roughly down the middle of it, or sort of to the left. DuPont Circle sits just east of it. And for much of the last part of the 20th century after the riots, the rule was you don't go east of Rock Creek Park. Past Rock Creek Park is black people and gay people and all these scary things. But as the city's gentrified, that line is pushed further and further east. And with it, the LGBTQ community, really, the community of gay men has expanded beyond that along what's called the Green Line to neighborhoods like Shaw and U Street. And so when I actually started going out to clubs when I was 17 and 18 and in college, that's where I would go, is to places on U Street and in Shaw. And there were, you know, apartment buildings along that corridor that like would gain a reputation as like the gay dorm, right? Because that is where, in general, affluent gay men lived and hung out. That was one form of it. Like you look at a map of DC now, like you mapped all the gay people I knew in DC. They just sort of strung out along the Green Line on either side of DuPont Circle. That's one way. The other way is that, you know, as I think queer people have become more accepted in society to some extent, you see a lot more of what I might call like suburban neighborhoods in the region. And I read a piece for Washingtonian magazine 5 years ago interviewing a couple, two gay men who lived in a neighborhood just outside of the city called Indian Spring, which is known for having probably 20 or 30 gay and lesbian couples on a single street, right? It is, to be fair, kind of a heteronormative version of gay life, right? They live in single family houses, they have kids, they work good federal jobs. This is a slot that like a lot of queer people in the DC area fit into, right? And it makes it easy to fit into a community like Montgomery County, where Indian Spring is, which is proud of itself for being very liberal. We have a number of gay mayors of different towns, and they all go to the same community meetings and complain about, you know, how we're building too many apartments like everybody else, like all the straight people. What intrigues me about that, though, is that if you look at where the gay urban neighborhoods are, and you look at where what I might call like the gay suburbs are, a lot of them, all of them are really east of Rock Creek Park, and a lot of them are in places that were historically redlined. My neighborhood where I grew up, which is called Silver Spring, has historically had a lot of queer people in it for a couple of reasons. One, because there's a ton of apartment buildings there, so it's affordable, relatively affordable place to live outside of the city. It's close to transit, and it was also the only neighborhood in Montgomery County that was redlined. If you look at maps from the 1930s, like my street where I live was the line between the area that was rated H, which was the very worst kind of neighborhood, and the single-family homes on the other side, which had a much higher rating. So I think there's sort of these two flavors of neighborhoods in the city. I'm not sure if there's a neighborhood anymore, right? You go to DuPont Circle today, it's got Sweet Green, it's got, you know, Starbucks, it's got all the nightclubs for straight people. Frankly, frankly like DuPont Circle is kind of basic, honestly. The clubs I end up going to a lot of them are gone. Apex, which was a long-running gay bar in DuPont Circle, which is in this very sort of ratty-looking industrial building when I would go there in my 20s. I'm only 34 now, mind you. Was closed about 4 or 5 years ago because it was bought by owners who wanted to restore it to its historic character as a 1907 carriage house. So they gutted the building and put the facade back the way it was and painted it really nice, and it's sat vacant ever since. There was a club called Town a few stops north on the Green Line, a neighborhood called Shaw, which is an old industrial building, and it was one of those like big, loud music, thumping noise dance clubs. It too closed. They saved the facade, painted it white, put an apartment building behind it. There was a neighborhood of bars that catered to sort of the whole swath of the LGBT community, gay bars, lesbian bars, dance clubs, places known for sex work, a lot of which were basically cleared out to build the baseball stadium in 2004, which is ironic now I think about wearing my Washington Nationals hat. It's pink, that's why I wanted to wear it. It's got the cherry blossoms on it. So like a lot of that life that I took for granted until I was like, you know, in my 20s in DC is basically gone. And a lot of it has decamped to the suburbs. Some of it in this very heteronormative form, some of it in some more radical forms. I have a friend who, she refers to her friends as the lesbians. She says, we would go, do you want to go hang out with the lesbians? They live in this big old house in a town called Hyattsville, which is one of the sort of crunchier towns to the east of the city. And they have their multiple adults and multiple children, multiple dogs living in this giant house that like, you can't see it from the street. It was an old farmhouse, they built the town around it, and it actually faces away from everyone else. And I actually know quite a few communities like that. You know, you can go on the DC Queer Exchange and you'll find occasionally an ad for, we are starting a queer intentional community, and we have rented a 5-bedroom house on a big piece of land. We're gonna grow vegetables out back. We're gonna have, you know, common areas for community events. It is very close to the very end of the red line, to the very end of the green line, and it's $600 a month for a room, which is absurdly cheap in the DC area. And if there's one thing that I find interesting about suburbs is that as they get older, as they age, as the sort of ongoing churn of white flight and middle class flight continues, because it never stopped, the older suburbs, the same places that are becoming homes to black and brown people and to immigrants and to lower income people, are also pretty queer, to be honest. Silver Spring is one of those places. Hyattsville is one of those places. and they have a lot of space. And that's something that like queer people were denied a lot, for a lot of our history in cities, right? Like you talked about how people live in very constrained places in urban centers. And even though the reason why a lot of queer communities are in the suburbs now is largely economic, they can't afford to be closer into the city, the flip side is you have a lot of space. And with that space, you can do things. I have been involved for the past 4 or 5 years with queer organizing in Montgomery County. And one of the challenges has been that there aren't the central gathering spaces that people took for granted just 20 or 30 years ago, right? Like, a lot of the places in DC are gone. The county it's 1 million people, it's 500 square miles. There are a couple of urban downtowns, but like there is no like one place that to go, right? The suburban neighborhoods we have are mostly just houses. There's an effort to start a pride center in the county, which has no physical location. But a lot of elected officials, because they want to sound like they're supportive, say, we can't wait to come visit you at the Pride Center. We just haven't funded it yet, it doesn't exist. And unlike the towns further out in Maryland and Virginia that are just far enough from DC that like it's a hassle to go downtown for Pride in the summer, they have their own Pride events. The suburban counties of Montgomery County have never had a Pride until 3 or 4 years ago, because the draw to come into the city was so strong, and especially if you were more professional, if you're more affluent, like you still could experience a queer life in the city. And so a lot of my work in the past couple of years has been trying to figure out like what does the space look like? There still isn't a space. Sometimes it is a party room in an apartment building. Sometimes it is somebody's living room where they have space to do it. Sometimes it is a plaza in a suburban town center that has been given over to Pride, which I think is pretty dope. The kind of places I would have loved to have when I was 15, 20 minutes away from my house. And I'm hopeful for the kids growing up in these places today where, just 20 years ago, you were not even allowed to speak of this, that like you can now go to your little suburban town center and possibly see some queer people at Pride, that you might have queer neighbors on your street who are out, who are comfortable, who are modeling any number of different lives that you might want to live. I had so many teachers growing up who, until much later, I learned were gay, and I realized that they were gay because they were the only teachers who did not speak of their home life. And when I was 12, trying to figure out why my 7th grade science teacher never talked about a wife or kids or anything, I could like feel the gears in my head like grinding, like what is my adult life supposed to look like? And that's sort of like a mental kind of space that I think, ironically, the suburbs are giving for people now. Like, you might be able to have this in some form too. Not because we intended to, but because we have some leftovers for you. But I'm being a downer, shit.
I thought that was kind of hopeful, actually.
Yeah. I'm gonna close out by saying I had a friend named Brian who lived in my town. He lived on a big state highway in a little green bungalow house. He was born in 1949, and he lived in that house with his husband for 25 years. He lived in the house for 27 years, 2 years after his husband passed away. And concurrently, my now ex and I were looking for a house. We spent 2 or 3 years looking for a house. Couldn't afford it, and I desperately wanted to stay in the town where I had grown up. And we went to the house. Brian's next door neighbor had a vacant lot, and we went to her. She had a little sign in the front yard saying, "We were going to sell your house." I want to sell my lot. And we went, spent an hour and a half in her house, and she told me all about, my next door neighbor is gay, my son is gay, I would love to sell you my lot. And then she told me how much she wanted the lot for, and we were not going to buy her lot. And somewhere along the way, Brian had caught wind of this, and he only told me this last year. He said, I was waiting for when I was ready to sell my house so I could sell it to you, because I felt it was really important to be able to give my house to another queer person. It was too late. My partner and I, my now ex-partner and I had bought a house. And there's so many, since he sold his house, it was too painful, he moved away to New York. And I wish I had spent more time asking him about what that was like, right? All these moments I talked about in DC gay history, he experienced them, right? All these moments in suburban gay history, he experienced them. He bought a house in the one place he could find on a busy state highway. And he spent his time in that house fighting for all of the things that his white cis-het neighbors hated, like buses running in front of his house. and he wanted to pay it forward to somebody else. And I would like to think that in all the ways the gay neighborhood is manifested in a metropolitan area now, there's lots of people like Brian who finally have a chance, they have enough that they can give to somebody else. So, that's my piece.
Thanks, Dan. I have kind of a convoluted question for you, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, which is, so I recently just bought a house too with my partner, and I saw it as like a form of like survival, essentially, like safety. Like, I need to buy a house because rents are going up so much that like it's now or never. It's not like I've always dreamed of being a homeowner. It's just like, this is what you have to do to stay in the city. But I think there's a real trade-off there, which is that I don't live in like a small apartment in a busy part of the city anymore. I do live further out. I don't go to the neighborhood gay bar, which was right nearby. I'm less involved in community life and more isolated in my house. Do you see that kind of transition where people are like, like queer people are saying, oh, I need to buy a house. It's the only way to like get by in our society, and therefore that's leading to some dissolution of community? And what should we do about that? Like, what I perceive as like an increasing isolation built around home ownership.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it was the same for me, right? Like, I wanted to be as close in as possible. I had a lot of memories of a lot of last dates that involved taking a boy home to Silver Spring. He's like, oh no, this is too far. But our landlord was going to raise our rent by 33%, and so it was now or never. We were going to buy a house or not. And so we bought the one house we could afford in the neighborhood we could afford to live in. That was a mile from the train. Little townhouse next to a food pantry run by the Adventist church, which is a lot of fun because they have feelings about queer people. And I had to get to hang my flag on the porch where they can all see it. And it's funny because, like I said, my neighborhood was one of the few suburban red line places in the region, and it is a place that historically has been known for accepting all of the people who could not live anywhere else. But the mentality in the neighborhood where I live, my neighborhood association, our vice president, is 2/3 non-white. And the leadership and membership is almost exclusively white. I am the first person of color on my neighborhood association board in possibly ever.
Wow.
And so, like, people live amongst all of this diversity and, like, a ton of queer people. And it is not spoken about, and it is the language that you see in this article right here. My neighbors still say it today, talking about apartment buildings or townhouses like my own townhouse. And it feels very like I still have to make a foothold here. I have to express my presence in this community and my rootedness in this place. Like, you cannot get rid of me. You cannot raise the rent on me. Like, you cannot intimidate me. Like, I'm going to be here with my fucking flag, and like, that's it. And it does create dissolution of community, right? There's so many people who are probably in my position in all these different places across the region. And the one reason I got interested in organizing both queer people and a queer Democrats organization in the county is that, like, I wanted to figure out how do you manifest any kind of space, even like if it's as a meeting every other week on a Monday night or something, because that's all you might get. I have been tied to pride organizations in Northern Virginia, because my ex is from there, and like they had a lot of happy hours. And I've been to a lot of very grim happy hours in hotel bars in the suburbs, but it is the one place where queer people can see each other in the suburbs, and across age lines, across lines of all the LGBTQ spectrum and gender presentation and everything, federal workers, not federal workers. And like that's what you get for a start. It is so dispersed. I'm almost envious of like the rural queer communities beyond that, like in the towns like Frederick and Westminster, like an hour and a half outside of DC, because like that's the only game in town. Like this is the one place where you go, so you can have queer life in your small town, because DC and Baltimore are too far away. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I was just thinking of it as sort of like a balance between like having, like being involved in the greater community, and then sort of like, it feels to me like sort of like getting isolated just with my partner in this little house in a way that feels very like hetero, it's like just our little family unit, but also that's exacerbated by the pandemic. But it's interesting what you're saying about like, while a lot of the physical spaces, like the bars have gone away, you're trying to find other spaces, such as getting involved in community organizations, even if it's not like a physical building, like a bar that's always open, or DuPont Circle as a place where you're like, yes, I'm going to see queer people there. You have to sort of like figure out different spaces you can get involved in that are maybe not physical spaces, but like temporal spaces.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is like one perk about like Suburban Gays is that like life revolves around schools a lot, and so you have affirming parents or you have out parents who do form those like little nuclei of queer community in schools, which is probably really good for the kids. It leaves the rest of us kind of I don't get to go to school, but it's something. And I didn't have it growing up, and I'm glad it's there now.
Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? I teach a comics class for teens, and the teens are all extremely queer. And one of them was just like, oh yeah, we just like made zines at my like school's GSA, Gay Straight Alliance, which didn't exist when I was in school. And I was like, oh, that's so cool, your school is GSA. And they were like, ugh, yeah, it's taken over by the 6th graders who are just like so loud about their sexuality. It's so annoying. And I was like, oh, that's so sweet. I love it. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was, this idea of like the city gay neighborhoods no longer being affordable for queer folks to live in, and then having to move out to the suburbs. I think something that like I struggle with a lot as a city dweller who like will not be able to afford the city much longer, is like where to move that is safe. Especially for like our trans communities and gender non-conforming communities, like just being able to walk down the street without weird looks. And like, I don't know, I was just kind of thinking about that in terms of like affordability in the old neighborhoods, and like how do we, I don't know, like where's the safety, I guess, in the suburbs, especially if there hasn't been an established queer community there before. I don't know if that's a question you can answer, but.
Actually, like, this is one, like, I always resist saying, like, that design has any determining ability in this place, but, like, at least in the DC area, the places where I see queer and trans people gravitating to when they can, whether to go or to live, are the downtowns that exist.
Yeah.
Like Silver Spring and Hyattsville, the two places I mentioned, are both old railroad suburbs that have downtowns. And in Silver Spring's case, has a ton of old apartment buildings, so it is cheaper. And, like, that alone, the physical form, has created a place where there's enough of us that you can feel at least a little comfortable there. It's not DuPont Circle, but it is more than the vulnerability. Like, imagine you're standing out by the side of the suburban highway waiting for the bus. Like, everyone feels vulnerable there, right? There is no infrastructure for you there. There is no sidewalk. There is no bike lane. There is no curb. There may not even be a bus stop. And that is like multiple layers of vulnerability. But even imagine on top of that, you are not gender nonconforming, right? You are exposed. And one of the recurring tragedies in Montgomery County has been like, there have been a number of, in the past couple of years, of trans women who are sex workers who've been murdered in like shitty motels further out of the city, right? Further out of the city, in these suburban places where like it is the most isolated and is the most vulnerable. And like there is like very much a spatial dynamic to it. Like I don't know if this carries to other cities. Like I don't know if the streetcar suburb in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Austin, Texas, do they have streetcars there? Is similarly a place where suburban people, you can go and feel safe in the suburbs. But I would like to think it creates enough of a good public realm that you can.
Is anyone here from a suburb or a small town and want to share a thought or story about that? Nobody?
I mean, I'm from a suburb.
Yeah.
But I live in the city.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, keep thinking on questions for Dan. We'll come back after Nancy talks. So thanks, Dan. Nancy, you're up.
I actually do have another question. if
Oh,
that's
great.
okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So I just, for me as a person of color who also grew up in DC, and just that like the intersectionality of being queer, and you know, like, so my family lived in DuPont Circle as immigrants from Bangladesh. My oldest brother, who couldn't speak English, played chess in the circle with like old black men, and then like there was, you know, white gay folks as gentrifiers of that neighborhood, really, and pushing out a lot of people of color. And I feel like, and then I saw that again when I lived in DC, like where white queer people would go move into communities of color, right? And so I think what's hard for me sometimes with the idea of gayborhood is that of like who's welcome, you know, because I found myself like in my 20s going out to like a bar in DuPont Circle and like white gay men acting like, you know, people perceive me as straight, whatever, like, you know, but like seeing me as an outsider, and I'm like, I was literally born here, you know, and you know, and I feel like that tension, and I just wonder if you could like address that as a person of color also navigating that world.
The first thing that comes to mind is there was a story in, what is it, the Washington City paper a couple years ago about sort of the racial dynamics of the community of gay men in DC, and that when people would, you know, go on Grindr or Craigslist or what have you, like, and, you know, go to somebody's home to have sex, that like they interviewed black guys and they said to a person, we don't want our white sex partners to come over here. I will go to your house. Like, I don't, partially because I don't want you to see where I live. I don't want you to know that, but I also don't want you to necessarily feel welcome there. So there's always this like, you know, the space that is conceived as common ground is usually, at least in DC, was perceived as a white space now, right? And so everyone has to come to it. But only, you know, the affluent, mostly white people get to exist there all of the time. And that I think is a perennial challenge with any historic neighborhood, right? Because we call it a historic neighborhood because it was usually a place where historically oppressed people lived, and then it was the neighborhood, another historically oppressed population, and now it is not the neighborhood. It is a place where the, you know, who are even more affluent, even more privileged could go. And I don't think I answered your question either. It sucks.
It's complicated.
You don't have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
It's okay. Esme, you have any thoughts, or should we?
Oh, no, you know, I'm thinking about the precarity of trying to hang on in the city, you know, and my spouse and I also finally bought a place last year, and then promptly went through a layoff situation, and like, so there's this there's an emotional cost to trying to hang on in the city, you know, and then, you know, of course, I also have an experience actually before coming out, living out in Hillsborough, and just really remarking, oh, how much more racially diverse Hillsborough is than Portland, right? And so now having come out and now having just barely managed to claw on to a place I can stay in the city, and experience a relative degree of safety as a trans woman. And yet, to have that, I'm also like trapped in this gentrifying whiteness world that I don't especially care for.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's interesting. All right, Nancy, I think you're up.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I do have some slides.
Oh, can we use your clicker, Esme?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank
Nope.
you. Is it this one?
Yep.
To go forward, but we need to bring up her presentation,
Yeah.
right?
It's just after this.
Ah, there we go. Okay. So, hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Haque. I work for Basic Rights Oregon, and we're a policy advocacy organization. And so what that means is we pass laws trying to make life easier for queer people in our state, and we've been doing that for about 25 years. For an example, this past session, we passed a ban on the trans panic defense so that it could never be used in our state. And we also codified into law that gender identity is a protected class in our state, along with sexual orientation. And so I have to say around housing, I'm not an expert, but I have been doing social justice work for about 25 years, and I've been thinking about housing a lot, and the sort of housing precarity, right, that we know queer people are living with right now. And so thank you for having me on this panel. And I think one thing I really enjoy about this conference is the ability to dream bigger, right, and think about what we really want. And even like, I actually hadn't seen the phrase abundant housing before. I was looking at what this conference was about. And like, I really love that. And I love this idea that we can have what we want, and the lives we want to lead, right? And so, and all that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about data today and just about like what actually is our housing precarity, because it feels like it's something we know, but there's not a lot of facts. And so I think in general, so I've been in leadership at Basic Rights Oregon for the past 7 years, and people always ask us for data. And we're like, hey, we're like 8 to 9 people working in a small office, and we don't actually have access of like, say, the US Census, or, you know, like all these data tracks that just don't exist about our community. And so I think there's very few places that actually have good data about our community. Oh, yeah. So, so not everybody wants to live in a rainbow house, but maybe I would, I don't know. Also, I do have to say, as people were confessing home ownership, yeah, I feel like, so I have a very historic Portland home. It was built in 1906, and I have a lot of pleasure in like, when this was built, it wasn't for me. That's awesome. Yeah, so, I really want to know who lived there before. But so today I'm just going to start by sharing some data points, and partly because I feel like for me to think about like what policy pieces, what we want to fight for, I just have to know the extent of the problem. And so that's sort of where I come from. And so today I'm going to share some data from the Williams Institute out of UCLA and the National Center for Transgender Equality, and I consider those trusted sources. And that said, they are definitely trusted sources, but none of the data is accurate or up to date given the pandemic. And I think we all know that all income inequality in the US has been deeply exacerbated by the pandemic. And so, and I also have to say that I think before we talk about just the houselessness and that level of housing precarity in the LGBTQ community, we need to talk about poverty in the LGBTQ community. And I think as much as like we've tried to expand the definition of who our community is, people still have that like 2 white gay cis men who live together and make a lot of money. And I feel like it's really challenging. And I have to say, like, for myself as a person of color who's been in charge of this organization in our state, like, people see me as an ally, people don't see me as part of the community, people feel like because we talk about racial justice so much and because we talk about queer, trans, and trans people of color that there's no place for them. And it's like, well, where did you think the place was for me before, right? And I feel like it's really, it's a continual challenge. And so I feel like for me, it's like, it's not that I have to say like, actually queer, Muslim, Bangladeshi people are queer, but here I am. And, you know, it's not like it's even people exactly like me. It's just that there's a lack of imagination about who our community is, and like it's something we really have to work to change, and that includes people in the queer community who are dealing with issues of deep poverty and often generational poverty. And so guess what? Cis gay men are richer than everyone else. So in a world where about 15% of the US is living at poverty or below, it's only 12% of cis gay men. And so this is from the Williams Institute in the fall of 2019. And don't ask me about cis bisexual women and why their level of poverty is so high and comparable to trans people in this study. I really don't know. It's kind of confusing to me, but it seems like cis lesbian women are comparable to cis straight women, and then, but when we come to the trans community in particular, there's just a much higher level of poverty as well as with bisexual women in this study. And I think that so if, for these folks, right, it's double the poverty rate than the rest of the country. And then, this one looks really bad, sorry. So this is looking at unemployment. And so at a time when unemployment, so this is from the US Trans Survey, which is the largest survey done of trans folks ever in the country by National Center for Transgender Equality. It was done in 2015, so this is kind of old, obviously pre-pandemic. They're doing it again this year, and so I think it's really important. And I have to say, in Oregon, we broke the server like the first night of the survey. We really encouraged people to fill it in, and so we have really robust Oregon data. But this is just for like the whole country. So at a time when overall unemployment was at about 5%, you see, barely, but you can see for like Native folks, for Black folks, it's like 3 times higher, 4 times higher. For Middle Eastern folks who are trans, it's 35%. So it's just like the unemployment rate is just really high. And I'm sorry, this is
just to clarify in this graph,
yeah.
so the white bar underneath is the general population unemployment rate,
Right.
and the solid line color bar is that rate among transgender people of that identity.
Yes.
So and the top, if you guys can't read, it's super blurry. It says overall American Indian, Asian, Black, Latino, Latina, Middle Eastern, multiracial, and white.
Right. And sorry, so you can go look at National Center for Transgender Equality. You can see it much clearer. Sorry for that poor cut and paste. You make that PDF into a Word document. It's just, this is what happens when you don't have your original research. But anyway, I'm not gonna stay there for too long, except to say, like, when this data came out in 2015, and my thought was like, what are we gonna do about this, right? Because obviously, as a small organization, we can't give everybody jobs. And so what my reaction was then was we started something called the Fair Workplace Project, where instead of like an employment service, right, we're like, we need to make employers better. And so we started going to employers to talk to them about transgender inclusion, about what it means to be a welcoming, affirming workplace, what it means to like call somebody by their pronouns, what it means to support somebody during their transition. And so pretty quickly we got a lot of customers, right? And so it's been really interesting, but we've gone like corporate, like, right, to like Amazon warehouses in Boardman, Oregon, to like, the Water Bureau, like, like all bureaus, the DMV, like right now we're going to start working with TSA, like basically going to employers and also people who face the public and talking to them about how to be better and how to make it so that they're really thinking about when they interview someone and they're like, something was just a little off about them, or that someone doesn't fit into their binary ideas of gender, that maybe they can stop, take a breath, and rethink what they're doing, right? And so I feel like I want to kind of do that around housing, like really think about like, what's our upstream approach, right? How can we be thinking more broadly and bigger? It's like, how do we make housing better, right? Mm-hmm. How is it not just like trying to fit into this like binary mold that like, workplaces try to put you in, but actually expand our thoughts about what housing can be. And so then just a little bit about, so obviously if you can't get a job, right, and your unemployment rate is several times higher, and especially if you're a person of color, right, because all that stuff disaggregated by race is much worse than for overall trans population. And so what this graph shows is, so this is people who've experienced houselessness in the last 12 months. So the 1.4% is the general population. The 2.5% is cis and non-binary LGBT folks, and the 8.3% is trans folks. And so I just really want to uplift this as like how many more times, right, that folks who are transgender are experiencing houselessness in the country. And this, again, is from the Williams Institute. And then, so that's the last 12 months. And then this is looking at houselessness, looking at race. So again, the 1.5 sort of general population, white folks, and then black. So black trans folks, the most likely, right? And Native folks to experience houselessness. And then lifetime experience with houselessness. You see on the left, people who are people of color and versus sort of just the general adult population of queer people. And most folks, over 71%, experience houselessness as adults. And so for the first time. And so I think I want to bring that up because I feel like there's a pretty well-known fact around 40% of houseless youth in the US are queer, right? In one way or another, right? And there's resources for them. And I think what's really disheartening, right, is how those kids grow up, right, and then become houseless adults or people who with housing precarity. And there's so little resource for LGBTQ adults who are facing precarious housing, who might need income protected housing. And it's just like over and over again in, you know, these past 7 years, you know, you get calls from people like, I was denied shelter, I was denied shelter, I was denied shelter. And so I think what, you know, is really it's very upsetting, right? Because I think a lot of youth, right, become houseless because of family rejection. But then there's also institutional rejection, right? If you don't fit into the binary and people say, we don't know where to put you, you're not gonna get a shelter space. You're not gonna necessarily get a motel space. You're not gonna get the emergency shelter that you need. And so I think that that's part of the reason it was very disheartening, right, in this city, in Portland, that a gay man working for our mayor was saying, we have a solution to the houseless issue, which is putting everybody in militarized, large camps, right, with thousands of people staffed by the Oregon National Guard. Because it felt like, yeah, it's, when you say it out loud, right? Right, it's just this, like, lack of understanding. Well, one, it's heartless, and it's rather draconian, right, and kind of fascist seeming to me. I don't know, I'm no expert. But it's also like, we aren't at the table. Like, no one's invited us to talk about our community. No one's talked about, like, where's the queer people, right? And how are they experiencing what we have to offer? And so I feel like there's been some, you know, there was like a queer affinity village that got some money from the city a couple years ago, and it still exists. But like, and people saw it as a huge victory, and you heard people who were part of that village saying, it's the first time I feel like I have a place that's home. Mm-hmm. And it was tense. It was tense on pallets. And I was like, no, we need more. This isn't a solution. This is not a solution. And like, this is pathetic, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is the best we can fucking do, sorry. But is tense on pallets, and people are like, this is the first time I felt like I had a home, because people need specific services, specific places that are queer and that are expansive of who our community is. And so I don't know what the solution is yet, but because of what's happening, Basic Rights Oregon, Pride Northwest, Equity Institute, Q Center, PDX Trans Housing, we're all starting to talk about what we want and what we want to build and what we can dream of and what we can fight for. And so I guess I'll just leave you with that thought that, you know, we are trying to think about what we can do and what we can improve and what we can make better for, you know, for hopefully everybody, but also really specifically addressing the needs of queer and trans folks who live in Oregon. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That's really powerful. I was curious, I was really struck by you saying like we're here to like envision a better world. Do you guys, Dan or Esme, have any ideas? Like what housing do you want to see for queer people and trans people, like in your best imagination?
More of everything, honestly. Like more of everything. There are so many conversations, maybe they have them here too, we have them where I live, where they say, well, we have too many apartments, there are too many little apartments, too many studios, too many one bedrooms, we need apartments we need homes for families. And like people just rattle that off without thinking about it. And embedded in that are so many assumptions about like, what is a family? What does a family need? I grew up in a one bedroom apartment with my mom. Like, that's a family. But also like what, you know, for queer people, when you come to a place for the first time and you don't have a network of people, sometimes the only housing you need is a room or a studio, and that's where you start. And when we say that we don't need studios or we don't need one bedrooms, what we're saying is that you can only come here if you are rooted in something already and you need a bunch of bedrooms. So like, more.
Yes. So I also want to draw, though, on those early 20th century labor visions of we can imagine a world of housing that is informal and smaller and cheaper and still housing, right? Not tents on pallets, right? And that is run through community organizations, right? And so if we look at the housing efforts of early 20th century labor unions, they're doing this, and it's not about forcing people into a family model, right? It's about getting people indoors. So I think there's inspiration in that. The other thing I'm thinking about is there are all kinds of ways that housing precarity filters through our community. So in my own life story, my family stayed in a multi-generational household with an elder who wasn't making some decisions that were unsafe for my child, because that's what we could afford for a long time, right? And like, so I have that experience of I think people also need to sit with what does it mean to stay in a bad housing situation, right? And I also in my life have the experience of staying in an abusive relationship because it's the housing you can afford, right? I really want to sit with this idea that freedom to come out, freedom of your heart, freedom to be who you are in the world depends on not being trapped in a bad housing situation. Okay.
Does anyone in the crowd have any questions or just ideas on what you want to see? How about Steph in the back?
First, this panel is just nourishing. One thing that we, like, I hear a question of what is shelter and what is housing? And one of the things that comes in between is the SRO, single room occupancy. And there's a lot of folks are like, SROs, and a lot of housing activities, like SROs are absolutely not housing. And I'm curious, and I lived long enough in New York City, I'm like, so you say Hell's Kitchen has no housing, like, so, I'm curious what your thoughts are, like, where this sits, what housing activists should be thinking of when we're talking about, like, what is shelter, what is housing? Knowing that it's a continuum.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say SROs are where my early 20th century displaced labor men, that's where they found shelter, right? And yes, there was all of the challenging social environment that are the reasons that cities banned SROs. All of that existed, but those men were indoors. Okay? And I think we need to, what is shelter, what is housing? I mean, this is like, you know, everything is a continuum, but I think part of a vision that gets more people indoors is a vision that is okay with a certain level of urban chaos and danger. And, you know, as a former New Yorker, like, people in Portland are rattled by things, and I'm just like, oh, Jesus, you have no idea, you know? So I want a city that's, and we're seeing this now, in some ways a city that's a little rougher can also be a city that offers a little more refuge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess we have to talk about zoning at one point in every panel, right? You showed the photograph of the house for waitresses in Seattle, right? So in built form, that is a single family house. In most places, that is legal to build that house. What happened in that house is not legal in most places due to zoning. You cannot have so many unrelated adults living together. You cannot have so many short-term stays in a house. And ironically, like, that built form is probably perfect for what it was being used for. It has a bunch of bedrooms, right? And a bunch of common areas people can have that sense of community. But like, we can legally build it, but we can't legally occupy it the way that we want to. And that's because of zoning. So zoning isn't just about like upzoning and building bigger buildings and making more buildings, but also like having flexibility to use the spaces that we already have in different ways to build queer families or multi-generational families. Like, all of these things are like not legal in most places just because the way zoning codes are written, because we anticipate a very specific type of household would live in them, regardless of how the house actually being set up or used.
You know, I know other places in this conference, people are probably talking about the model of housing where you have many smaller 800 square foot units, 700 square foot units, and a shared community space, right? That's a great model for queer community, you know? So yes, there's the how you use the space, and then there's envisioning spaces that look really different, right? Especially the model of shared kitchen space. Like, there's a deep feminist history of longing for that. You look at what was done in Vanport, right? They did that in Vanport because they knew that women would be working those industrial shipyard jobs, you know, and so it allows for collaborative childcare and all of those sorts of things. So anything that allows domestic labor to be shared, I think is good for queer people. You know, housing is productive of bodies. Right? The job of housing is to produce bodies, right? What kind of bodies is the housing producing, right? And often housing is producing bodies in a commodified way, but we can think of housing as being liberatory in the kind of body it allows you to inhabit, if that makes sense.
I think I've lived in Portland long enough to remember, like, when there were still a lot of SROs downtown in the late 90s, and I think that because the city moved away from them, right, and because I think in general, but I feel like, to me, I feel like if we do them again, we can do them better, right, because we have a lot more knowledge right now. I think of, like, what's trauma-informed, what's, like, how can we have SROs with services? How can we have people who need mental health care get that mental health care? Like, you know, I think there's just, like, a way where we can do it better than what was done before, which is just, like, if you just stick a bunch of people in a building and say bye, it's not going to work in the same way, right? And there is going to be some bad chaos. I think there is also some good chaos that comes from cities, but I feel like there was a lot of, you know, not good things, right, that happen in SROs as they were. And so it's just like, it's part of that, like, we do have more knowledge now. We can't go back to what was a good idea in 1985, right? We have to go back to what we know now and do it better.
I think we have time for one more question. Unless you have something you want to say.
I was going to say we have a model of SROs today, and it's called We Live. You know, WeWork's like version of housing where you have a bedroom and you have a shared common area, except it is obviously marketed to a very specific type of individual with money, and the domestic work in those properties is usually done by outside help. But like, it shows that you can do it, and if you trust people to like live in a place that is like nice, right? You can make a nice place for them.
Mm-hmm. And you had your hand up in the front. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, in Oregon, when you have co-ops, there's a lot of the stuff you're
Yep,
talking
yep.
about, it's like co-housing,
Yep,
co-ops,
yep.
Yeah.
which is what we're working on
Yep.
in Washington.
Yep.
And the other thing that kind of triggered me was wondering whether you had housing organizations specifically for transgender and sexual minorities. If that is, because that's where you start to get this housing stock, because then you get funding for it. So I don't know if you're in that, where you are in that development.
So there's a all-volunteer group called PDX Trans Housing, but there's not like a big group that's working, as far as I know, that's working on trans-specific housing.
Do they have a website so I can connect with them?
I don't know. They might.
See, that's the problem.
Yeah.
I'm a real estate lawyer. I can help them, but.
Oh, that's interesting. Great. Well, yeah, go for it.
It's okay to answer no, but is anyone aware of like fair housing style paired testing for like transgender and queer people?
That would have helped me when I partner and I were buying a house.
What's is anyone aware of fair housing style paired testing for queer and trans people?
It's like secret shoppers essentially. They do it by race.
Like secret shoppers for housing, where they see if somebody's discriminating against either renters or home buyers, where they send them out, take data, and can build a case against somebody if they are discriminatory.
They've done this for same-sex couples. I know that much, but beyond that, I don't know.
The city of Seattle does that.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and thanks to our panelists, Esme, Dan, and Nancy. You're so great. That was really wonderful. I'm so glad you're working on those issues.
So nice.
We're trying.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, we did it.
It's really like, it's such an emotional thing. I think everyone has
last
such
week
like
I was like, I
a
don't know
strong
how
connection to
I'm
housing.
gonna
It's like the basis
pull
of
this
everything.
off.
So I'm just glad to hear you're working